She stepped into the clearing as though the wind itself had drawn her forward, her boots leaving prints deep in the frost-hardened earth. Tala Nez was unlike anyone Colt Avery had ever encountered. Towering, with shoulders squared against the biting cold, and eyes sharp with intelligence and something harder, something born of unrelenting survival, she seemed to command the snow-drenched ridge before him without a word. Colt had ridden these highlands for years, expecting only the solitude of cold skies and the steady rhythm of his own horse's hooves, yet here she was, a living force that defied every expectation he had ever carried. The instant he saw her, he knew that this was no ordinary woman. This was a character carved from storms and tempered by hardship, the kind of person who might break a man, or teach him to stand taller than he thought he could. She paused, surveying the ridge with a quiet ferocity that betrayed a mind always calculating, always aware. Colt studied her carefully, noting the tension in her stance, the way her hands twitched near the edge of her pack, the subtle flexing of muscles beneath her buckskin coat. She was alert, ready for threats, yet there was a rhythm to her caution, a method to her watchfulness that spoke of years surviving against forces that sought to claim her. For a moment, Colt felt the oddest mixture of admiration and apprehension. Here was a woman who carried the wild as if it were a cloak, who could outmatch most men in resilience, yet whose presence demanded respect rather than fear. "Who are you?" He called across the hollow, trying to keep his voice calm, though the wind carried it in jagged edges toward her. She did not answer immediately. Her gaze lingered on him, dark and assessing. Then, in a voice low and steady, she replied, "Someone who doesn't run." The words landed with an impact that made Colt pause. There was no bravado, no false courage in them. Just the plain truth of experience. Someone shaped by necessity to endure, to confront, to move forward even when the world had turned against her. Colt approached slowly, keeping the distance respectful, aware that this woman, so tall, so self-possessed, so impossible to categorize, was both a mystery and a test. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "This ridge isn't forgiving to those unprepared." "I've been unprepared before," she admitted without emotion, and the casual acceptance of hardship made him wary. Not of her danger to him, but of the weight she carried. She had lived through something more ferocious than the cold, something that had left her vigilant, unyielding, and reluctant to trust anyone's intentions. Colt noticed the faint marks on her arms, the discoloration of her fingers from the frost, the pale bruises forming along the curves of her shoulders beneath the buckskin. He guessed that she had traveled far, evading pursuit, escaping death more than once. And yet, despite the evidence of struggle, she did not slump or stumble. She moved with deliberate grace, each step measured, each breath steady, and every glance scanning for threats. She was danger to herself only if the world proved faster or crueler, and even then, she seemed prepared to meet it head-on. "You have a name?" Colt asked finally, crouching slightly to appear less imposing. "Tala," she replied, voice soft now but still holding the echo of steel. "Tala Nez." Colt nodded slowly, committing the name to memory. It carried with it the weight of someone not easily subdued. He knew then that this encounter would not be simple. She was no bride of convenience, no fragile companion to ease loneliness in a cabin. She was a person with history, agency, and courage enough to force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about survival, loyalty, and human connection. "Then Tala," he said, "this land is harsh, and you're far from safety. Let me help you down from the ridge." He kept his tone neutral, careful to offer aid without condescension. She studied him again, weighing the offer. The wind tugged at her coat and hair, but she remained still, a living statue of defiance and endurance. Finally, she nodded, though just barely, signaling acceptance without surrender. Colt extended a hand, not as an order, but as a gesture of partnership. She took it, her grip firm, and together they moved toward a sheltered hollow he knew would offer some protection from the snow and wind. As they reached the small outcropping, Colt built a fire, the flickering flames illuminating the sharp lines of her face and the shadowed determination in her eyes. She remained standing for a moment, surveying the surroundings, then lowered herself to sit beside the warmth. Every motion she made conveyed strength, self-reliance, and careful control over the exhaustion she would not yet allow to show. Colt observed, noting how even in her silence there was communication, of trust being measured, of judgments being made, and of the awareness that he too would be tested. "You've been running," he said, breaking the quiet, "haven't you?" She looked up at him then, gaze steady and unflinching. "Not from what I can handle," she said. "From what I can't change." Colt recognized the truth of that statement. It was a philosophy of survival, a testament to someone who had endured hardship beyond ordinary comprehension. And in that recognition, a thread of connection began to form, tenuous but real. He understood that whatever danger or challenge lay ahead, it would not be a simple matter of protecting her, it would be a shared endeavor, one demanding respect, awareness, and the courage to act together. He offered her a blanket and motioned toward the fire. "Warm yourself. You'll need strength for the trail ahead." She accepted silently, tucking the furs around her shoulders, her eyes never leaving his. There was wariness, yes, but also a subtle acknowledgement. She understood the offer, recognized his skill and intent, and was willing to accept aid without surrendering autonomy. In that moment, Colt realized that the central conflict of this encounter was not merely survival in a frozen landscape. It was trust, negotiation, and the beginning of a bond forged under circumstances neither had chosen but both would have to navigate. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the first faint whispers of danger. Tracks, movement, the intangible sense of watchers in the vast expanse of snow. Colt adjusted his rifle, placing it within reach, and kept his eyes on Tala. She sat upright, shoulders squared, expression alert yet controlled. Together, they were a study in contrast. The seasoned cowboy, aware of threats and trained in skill, and the towering fierce woman, tempered by necessity and instinct. As the first hints of dawn colored the horizon, Colt felt the tension of the night ease slightly, though not fully. He knew that danger would return, that challenges would demand more than endurance. They would require judgment, courage, and the tentative formation of trust between them. And he also knew, with a clarity born of observation and instinct, that Tala was no ordinary companion. She was extraordinary, a character that would shape the trials to come as much as they would shape her. For the first time in many winters, Colt felt the stirrings of anticipation, not just for survival, but for the way this unusual, brave, and unyielding woman might change everything he thought he knew about his world. The ridge, the snow, the looming threat, they were only the backdrop. The real story had begun in the shared acknowledgement of strength, courage, and the understanding that two lives, brought together by circumstance, were now bound by a challenge that would demand every ounce of skill, instinct, and heart. And as they settled by the fire, side by side yet not yet fully allied, Colt Avery knew that the coming days would test them both, but perhaps in the process, reveal the deepest truths of survival, loyalty, and human connection. The first light of dawn crept over the ridge, painting the snow in pale gold and pink, yet Colt Avery's thoughts were far from the beauty of the morning. He knelt beside Tala Nez, who was awake and alert despite the exhaustion etched into her tall frame. Her dark eyes scanned the distant slopes, following the rhythm of the wind as if it carried whispers of unseen danger. The night had been long, filled with the sound of coyotes calling across frozen valleys and the restless crackle of the fire, but nothing had shaken her resolve. She had survived far worse, and Colt realized, not for the first time, that she was more than a companion in need. She was a force to reckon with, a partner in survival. "The tracks are fresh," Tala said quietly, pointing toward a slope where the snow had been disturbed. Her voice, though soft, carried authority. "They've been close all night. Whoever follows me doesn't stop easily." Colt adjusted his rifle, eyes narrowing. He had seen many trails, many signs of pursuit, but this was different. The prints were too precise, the spacing deliberate, as though the hunter knew exactly what they sought. "Then we move fast," he said, keeping his tone calm. "We can't give them a chance to close in." She nodded, packing her few belongings with practiced efficiency. Every motion revealed a life lived in constant preparation, a readiness for danger that had become second nature. Colt noticed the faint bruises along her arms and shoulders, the subtle tension in her muscles, and he understood that her body was as prepared as her mind. Tala was not simply surviving, she was strategizing, anticipating every move the world might force upon her. They set off down the ridge, moving with care over the ice-hardened ground. Colt led, breaking a path with his boots, while Tala followed closely, her senses alert to the slightest shift in the wind, the smallest crack of ice, the faintest trace of movement in the distance. Their journey was silent at first, punctuated only by the occasional whisper of words, small acknowledgments of direction or condition. Colt respected her quiet, sensing that speech was a tool, not a necessity, and that her thoughts were always several steps ahead of their movements. "Why do you run?" he asked finally, breaking a long silence. The question was not accusatory, but genuine. He needed to understand the woman beside him, to gauge not only her skills but her motivations. Tala's eyes met his, unwavering. "I run because stopping means death, or worse, surrender," she said. Her tone carried no complaint, only a hard-won acceptance. "I refuse to bow to war that serves no one but the greedy and the blind. My people call me traitor, but I call it survival." Colt considered this as they descended a narrow path flanked by icy cliffs. He had faced outlaws, storms, and long stretches of solitude, but this was different. Tala's defiance, her courage, and her strategic mind made him both wary and intrigued. Here was someone who did not merely react. She anticipated, she calculated, she endured. He felt a growing respect for her, mingled with the undeniable tension that came from walking with someone who could hold her own in life or death circumstances. The wind picked up, howling through the gorge, carrying with it the distant clatter of hooves on frozen earth. Colt tensed, his hand tightening on the rifle. Tala paused, crouching slightly, eyes narrowing, listening. She pointed with a subtle gesture. "They are not far. Too many to outrun if they spot us in the open." Colt scanned the slopes, noting the shadows among the sparse trees. He had known pursuit before, but this was meticulous, patient, and dangerous. He nodded at Tala. "Then we use the cover," he said. "The ravine below. It will give us concealment and a way to control the approach." She moved with quiet efficiency, lowering herself down the slope with a grace that betrayed her size and strength. Colt followed, aware that the descent demanded attention, and that any slip could give their pursuers an advantage. Yet as he moved beside her, he realized something crucial. Tala was not a burden. She was an equal in every sense, fierce, capable, unyielding, and fully aware of the stakes. The partnership was tentative, unspoken, but undeniable. They reached the ravine, its walls of jagged rock and snow offering both shelter and strategic advantage. Colt set the firewood they carried aside and began to prepare a small defensive perimeter, while Tala scanned the ridges above, noting every movement. Her instincts were uncanny, and Colt relied on them without hesitation. He realized that survival was no longer about individual skill, it was about collaboration, about understanding and anticipating each other's choices under pressure. Night fell again, bringing darkness thick and complete, and with it the sound of distant footsteps, whispers of movement that hinted at the hunters closing in. Tala remained calm, crouched near the fire, eyes bright in the flickering light. Colt admired the discipline and control, and felt a rare sense of partnership that went beyond mere survival. He knew that they could not afford mistakes. Every decision mattered, every moment could be the difference between life and death. "The fire is a risk," Tala said quietly. "It draws attention." Colt nodded, adjusting the embers, letting the glow soften. "Better a fire than frozen hands," he replied. They shared a small, knowing glance, mutual recognition of judgment under duress. Hours passed in tense quiet. The snow whispered and shifted around them, the occasional crack of ice a reminder of the vulnerability that surrounded their fragile shelter. Yet they persisted, each move measured, each breath deliberate. Colt observed Tala, noting the ways she adapted to the environment, how she maintained focus without faltering, and how her presence had reshaped his own approach to the perilous landscape. Finally, the faint light of dawn began to pierce the darkness again. Colt and Tala emerged from the ravine cautiously, alert to every sound, every shadow. They had survived the night together, the first test of coordination, trust, and mutual reliance. There was no triumph, no fanfare, only the quiet acknowledgement that they had endured and that their journey was far from over. Colt looked at Tala, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel something beyond vigilance. There was respect, yes, and gratitude, but also a sense of connection forged in adversity. Tala returned his gaze with quiet acknowledgement, a small nod that conveyed understanding, readiness, and agreement. They would face what came next together. The ridge stretched ahead, cold, uncertain, yet no longer a landscape they would traverse alone. Danger lingered, but so did determination, courage, and a nascent trust. The central conflict remained unresolved: pursuit, survival, and the looming threat of those who would hunt Tala, but the foundation had been laid. Colt Avery and Tala Nez had survived one night, and with each step, each decision, each glance, they were becoming more than strangers. They were allies, partners, and a force against the peril that stalked them. And as the morning sun began to chase the shadows from the snow-covered slopes, Colt understood that the story was no longer about one person's endurance or another's survival. It was about two lives converging under impossible circumstances, each shaping the other, each learning that trust and courage were the true tools against a world that offered neither mercy nor certainty. Together, they moved forward, ready for whatever the ridge, the snow, and fate had yet to deliver.